Thank you very much, Liz, and thank you for inviting me. It's an honor and privilege to speak to all of you. And it's always a challenge to speak after David. Such an eloquent speech, such a rich messages he put, and all the 10 lessons. I think all of my presentations is already there in some way or the other. And those who are attending this meeting from the beginning in the morning, so please bear with me another PowerPoint torture. Possibly this is the last of today. So you are, some of you are aware about this right-hand side diagram. Hope you can see my screen and can hear me clearly. So this was from the GARD report of 2019, where we have been talking about that the future of risk reduction would be possibly living with uncertainties. And I think that it was in 2019. Which was published in the global platform. And then what we have seen that last 1.5 years, still actually ongoing, how this pandemic has really brought us into this very key word, living with uncertainties. Uncertainties not only just on the climate extreme, uncertainty not only just on the public health, uncertainty not only on the socioeconomic impacts or the livelihood issues. I think it's a whole, we often call this systemic risk, but I will say it's a system of uncertainties where we are currently living. And that's how these traditional approaches of risk reduction or traditional approaches of risk management is going to face many different challenges. Again, a little bit of background. All of you are aware, 2015 was the landmark year with all the 3 or 4 major global frameworks, starting from SDG, Paris, and the Sendai framework. And last year was supposed to be a super year for 5 years from this framework, where we were expecting lots of midterm evaluation, but I think it became a super year in a different context, especially how this global pandemic or the public health emergency, it brought all different aspects of sustainable development, disaster risk reduction, and as an added issues of these global climate extremes. We have been doing this analysis of these particular frameworks and all this thing, and I won't go into the detail of it. But I would like to just highlight that all these frameworks talk about one very important issue, which is called local. And, this particular term local, L-O-C-A-L, local has been used 10 times in 35 pages of SDG, 48 times in 25 pages of Sendai, and 9 times in 32 pages of Paris Agreement. And it has been used widely in terms of the local authorities, local communities, local culture, local knowledge, local priorities, local adaptations, and so on. So that was possibly a fascinating thing which we did not see in the previous global frameworks, that even any global frameworks recognize the implementation at the local level. So local implementation becomes a very key element in all the global frameworks. And another things also I would like to highlight about the importance of public health issues in Sendai framework. Many of you are participating from Sendai, and you are very much aware about this Sendai framework document. And I was just checking about that how many times this word health has been used. It has been used 76 times in 37-page document of the Sendai framework. So I think thanks to some of our health experts, health champions, many of you know Virginia Murray and her team, who have been from the Public Health England, who have been working very strongly, advocating very strongly the importance of these public health issues as a part of the disaster risk reduction framework, whether it is in terms of the primary health, secondary health, or the tertiary health. So Sendai framework, like two specific important issues. One was the health has been integrated very strongly, and the scope of hazards have been expanded widely. Earlier, what we used to call the natural hazard, now we have this particular Sendai framework has also expanded it to biological hazards, the cascading hazards, and so on. So it's not only just the so-called natural hazards we are talking about biological hazards, the technological hazards, and so on. So the scope of hazards have been quite expanded. In 2019, again, some of you might be aware that WHO brought this very unique document called Health EDRM, Health Emergency Disaster Risk Management Framework. And that became a sort of global document that how you consider or how you incorporate the health issues in the emergency and risk management. In 2019, UNDRR, they had this resilience scorecard, that is the safer city campaign, like how you make your urban areas or cities more resilient. So there has this campaign or this particular scorecard has been there for some time, but they have added the health addendum, like the urban health issues becomes increasingly important. So how you actually incorporate those. And that has been again done in 2019. Myself with one of my colleagues from Chinese University of Hong Kong, Emily Chan, who is again a very prominent health expert, WHO's expert member. So with her, we published a book on public health and disasters. It was in January 2020. And we never imagined that the whole 2020 and 2021 till now, we'll be discussing so strongly about these public health issues and the global pandemic and the emergency disaster risk management. But by saying that, I would like to, in this particular book, actually, we try to highlight that public health issues, like we always say that the earthquake risk reduction is not just the subject of the seismologist or the earthquake engineering. Yes, we need to understand the origin of the earthquake. Yes, we need to understand possibly the building vulnerabilities or infrastructure vulnerability, but it goes beyond that. Similarly, public health is not just the domain when it comes about public health and disasters or health emergency disaster risk management. It's not just the domain of only public health expert. It needs to incorporate all different issues, whether it is the financing and fiscal policy, whether it is the data management, scenario projection, the logistic issues of the supply chain management, resource mobilization, recovery issues, livelihood issues, and so on. And we have been experiencing this possibly last 1.5 years. I will come back to this issue a little bit later. Again, a very popular diagram, possibly many of you are following this series of reports. So this was the World Economic Forum Global Risk Outlook, the regular annual report. This was from 2020, and we all recognize that at least for last 10 years or so, we have been seeing increasing the environmental risk coming on the top in terms of the likelihood and impact. So what you are seeing here, the green boxes in the top 5, the upper part is the likelihood and the lower part is the impact. So this has been trend, and we have been recognizing that. But if you see this year, 2021 report, which is actually an analysis of last year, I think two things are coming very strongly, and that is quite alarming. In terms of likelihood, obviously, in terms of the impact, the infectious disease has been the top. So that's very obvious. But when you see the likelihood part, there are these two little bit, how do you call the magenta color, which is the it's more on the technological risk. And these are the two issues which are the digital power concentration and digital inequality. These two are becoming or taking its position as the top global risk in terms of likelihood. That means for last 1.5 years, what we have been seeing, that more sort of diverting from like work from home, education, online education, then online healthcare, online banking. So more we are shifting, like having the distance, right? So in that case, the people who have the good digital connectivity and the people who does not have the digital connectivity. I heard our very interesting presentation from the students actually also pointed out this issue briefly, like the urban and rural divide, then the developing countries divide, then possibly the young people and the aged population divide. So we are creating a digital divide, and this power concentration, digital power concentration, and this inequality is going to be possibly some of the future risk which we need to focus on very, very carefully. And we have also seen the impacts on the livelihood. So you can see the livelihood crisis, partially, not partially, possibly quite strongly actually because of this infectious disease. Those were also on the impact side. So if I summarize that, what has been the overall trend in the global risk and the frameworks? So one is the importance of the local implementation, importance of the health issues in Sendai and expanded scope of hazard. Then we are talking about more the complex emergency, and this pandemic is not just purely an health issue. It has a very strong consequence of socioeconomic, environmental, other developmental consequences. And what we are, again, this infectious disease and the technological risk. So the overall risk landscape is changing, and it has actually changed drastically. It has been changing possibly, what do you say, the creeping changes, slow changes over time. But I think last 1 year, it has changed quite drastically, and technological risks are becoming also major part of the like the overall risk landscape, which we need to possibly deal in future. So that's my first part. And I will have two other parts. My second part will be focusing more on the COVID pandemic and the public health issue. And the third part, briefly, I would like to provide some specific messages that what we need to go from here. So the second part, let me start with some of the work which we did with UNDRR. This was last year. We did some policy notes with UNDRR, especially how we link the biological hazards into the Sendai framework, and especially like how we incorporate into more the comprehensive risk assessment. So some of the slides come from there. So when you think about biological hazards, we have been living with different types of pandemic over years. So there are possibly different categories. One is the existing one, another one is the emerging one. One is emergency, one is non-emergency. So COVID-19 actually brings us to the very specific quadrant, which you see here on the right bottom, that it is an emerging as well as emergency. And these 2 points makes the major challenge. David had more eloquently actually explained these issues, that it is emerging in the sense that we possibly don't understand the risk properly. And emergency means the rate of spread or the impact of the spread. It is not only just spreading widely, thinly, it is also spreading like it is widely and very deeply. So that width and the depth of its spread makes it emergency, and that gives us a major challenge. And that's why strategic risk assessment, rapid risk assessment, post-event assessments are some of the key issues. And when you talk about the drivers of the biological risk, there are like infectivity, some sort of public health related terminologies like pathogenicity or virulence. I'm not an expert on that, but this comes from our little literature review on what are the different drivers of the biological hazards. But then the capacity of the individual, capacity of the community, capacity of who are the key stakeholders, what are the different types of susceptibility of getting infected, or the different types of exposures. I think this whole complex phenomena becomes the drivers. And since, as I mentioned in the earlier slide, that since it is emerging and also in terms in the emergency stage, so this whole structure becomes more complex. So to understand that, we try to do some sort of analysis from the past different experience of pandemic/epidemic. We started with Spanish flu of 1918, then SARS, swine flu, MERS, Ebola, and Zika. So these were the 6 major pandemics/epidemics we tried to analyze. And we try to see that what are the key lessons of which are coming up, and how those lessons are can be actually applicable in the modern context. I have the full report, and if someone is interested later, I can share and you can have a look at those reports. So of course, at the earlier stage, pandemic legislation becomes very, very important. Real-time monitoring becomes very, very important. Then technology innovations, then early warning system, contextualization of risk tools and updation, and different types of sector-specific impacts. So there are lots of different issues which we can actually learn if we go back to our history of different past pandemics/epidemic. With that background, let me show you some of our research results in the last 1 year. I must say that since last 1 year, I could not do overseas travel. So in one way, it was quite productive, and sitting in home and doing all the online classes, online meetings, and so on, it saves quite a bit of time as well as energy as well. So it has been a productive year to do lots of new type of research. We started with something understanding the risk, and this is with one of my Chinese colleagues in Keio University. We try to understand in the infodemic itself. And if you see the date of this particular research, it was published on 25th of March last year. So this was the time, and like it was accepted, sorry, 25th of March and published on 30th of March. So that is the very early time when this whole sort of pandemic has been still evolving. And we took this lens of the infodemic, and our main justification was that this particular pandemic is very invisible. It's non-measurable, unlike the radioactive disasters. Like we have seen that Fukushima radioactivity is also invisible, but you can at least measure. But I always say that if we can have that type of innovative tool, which can give you some sort of sensor that, oh, in your surrounding, the virus level is high, medium, low, that would have been a very, very good invention. But we are still unable to measure the level of virus in our air or in the surrounding. Yes, there are certain measures, but it's only when it comes to the proximity. So then maybe with some specific ultraviolet ray and all these things, you can see that one, but the measurement, I think, is very important. And due to that, the information is the key, right information is the key. Trust in the information, the source of the information is essential. And this type of fake news, which we have seen for last 1 year over different types of social media. I think this year, this particular paper, we were analyzing the Chinese case, because that was the very initial stages, and tried to, with my colleague, Chinese colleague, who actually analyzed different types of Chinese literature, then the Chinese Weibo and WeChat, the social media, that which type of information, how the key informations were spreading, what were the different regulations which was put forward. And this was very interesting that on 28th January of 2020, the Chinese Supreme Court make a directive on fake news. And that was a very wise decision, I must say, at a very early stage, anticipating that this type of fake news may come. So I think, and also there were a fake news check on Baidu's platform, that if you have some news, you can check and it can give you whether it is an authentic news. So I think, again, my main point of showing this is the understanding the infodemic risk. And now you see it has changed from the virus to our vaccine. Now there has been so much of news on the side effect of vaccine, on different types of vaccine, whether it works for this type of groups, whether it works for this type of different types of comorbidities and so on. So again, there has been lots of confusions there. So again, this infodemic risk still continue even after 1.5 years. The risk assessment part, this is a small, I for each of the slide, I gave the link of our paper. So those who are interested can take a screenshot, or I can share this presentation later. So this was a small risk assessment tool, which our team, I have this private startup, and so our team in RICA, it's called Resilience Innovation Knowledge Academy, what we developed. It's a very simple tool. Like we made this for, like, try to understand your own exposure. So the health, behavior, exposure, and the social policy. And based on that, it gives you some sort of different types of risk meter, we call. And it was very effective, again, at the initial stage. Now, possibly we need to customize this based on the different types of other available tools. But this was, again, generated quite an early stage. And so, again, the point is that it is important, like when we do this type of analysis with the location, or actually if there is an interface of the mapping, and then that map can be used very wisely by the local government, that where are the key concentrations of this type of the highly vulnerable people, whether they are a different age group, different residential types, then different types of community compliance, and so on. So I think the risk assessment and its link to the communication and governance is very important. The risk governance part, this is again a very important analysis. I always say that the pandemic is global, but its responses are local. And our students' presentation is also very, very interesting to see the comparative analysis of China, Malaysia, and Japan. And I think I remember the last slide where you were showing that whether it is the PCR test, whether it is the lockdown, which works, which did not work, or which type of measures the country has taken. And in case of Japan, this was an analysis from Japan, and like our main target was, we are not preaching for the good things in Japan, but what was our main target is like to make some sort of analysis that what was behind the initial flattening of the curve. And that is very, very important because of 3 reasons. Japan had a very close proximity to China. There were 7, in the peak time, there were 7 direct flights between Wuhan and Tokyo. So very high route, like high volume route. The second point is the high aged population in Japan. All of you know that. And the third point is the urban density in the Japanese major cities like Tokyo or Yokohama or Nagoya or Osaka. So because of these 3 things, it was very important at the initial stage that how the peak will come anyway. but whether the health system is equipped enough to absorb that particular shock. And that is what we call the adaptive capacity. So I think Japan did some very good work at the initial phases for border control, cluster approach, and the scenario planning. I think these three things really helped them to reduce this particular peak, so that, of course, there were some trouble. There were still lack of maybe in some cases the ICU beds and so on, but we did not see the type of major failure of the system, say, for example, in New York or many other major Western cities. We did not see that in Japan. So I think one of the main reason is the scenario-based decision-making and the proper risk communication. And there are some other in this also paper we analyzed that what are other, like the cultural issue, the basic healthcare system, basic sanitation, food habit, immune system, and how it actually helped Japan to at least initial cope with disasters and so on. And of course, last year we have seen so many different other disasters, so-called the natural hazards, but also we had this major another biological hazards, which is the locust intrusion. It was very prominent in East Africa and South Asia, and all other different types of natural hazards. But also we had a couple of technological hazards. There were a few sort of explosion in the factories and so on. So this cascading and the multi-hazard risks, so natural hazard induced biological hazards, and that was one scenario. But then when there is a biological hazards, then the natural hazards come. And then the combination of possibly other type of hazards like technological hazards and so on. And that gives like last year also, we have seen that in southern part in the Kyushu area in Japan, there were major flooding, and there was so much of challenges in the traditional approach of emergency response and the evacuation. So that's where this whole concept of adaptive governance come, that how we address this cascading risk. So whether it is the volunteer management, whether it is the shelter management, whether it is the evacuation issues. So there were quite a bit of new learning, and we are now trying to, we did some compilation of this as a terms of report, but we are planning to do some sort of academic journal paper for that as well. So this was in your journal, David. Thank you very much for accepting the paper. But this was an analysis of the fiscal boosting. And this is again, like last year, we have seen that many countries has done lots of fiscal boosting in different areas. And Japan has the largest percentage, but it's not just the percentage which matters. Our argument of this was that somewhere certain aspects of the fiscal boosting, I'm talking about in terms of numbers. There were problems we still see in the TV and the mass media coverages that possibly the money has not reached yet. But people say that the government says that they will give the compensation. It's very slow process and all this type of thing. Yes, in Japan, every governmental process is very careful and very slow. But the point is like whether we have a proper governance mechanism to absorb that particular types of boosting. And we argued that three specific national projects, one on the Society 5.0, one on the National Resilience Planning, and another one is the local SDGs. So these were already existing avenues. And when you have the fiscal boosting, there needs to have some specific channel. But because again, there needs to be an implementing agency. You can't just give an COVID fiscal package and just tell somebody to implement that one. So since Japan had already this type of major channels for multi-billion-dollar investment, So this additional package which actually came, it could mobilize it much strongly. I won't go into the details of the COVID-19 SDG impact. There have been quite a bit of new work which has been done, but I would like to just focus on other issues on what we try to argue on this ecocentric, the green recovery. So this has been a good chance for us for the COVID-19 during lockdown. You must be hearing lots of news that the color of this particular river is now changed, or people were saying, I heard some news from India that people could see the Himalayas from their town maybe 30 years, after 30 years or 40 years, like that. So taking that opportunity, what we were arguing, that of course economic recovery is very important, but can we try to argue on this ecocentric green recovery? And we have put a few basic essentials. We say that 10 essentials for ecocentric green recovery, and we have a specific paper for that. So summarizing this part is like we try to take many lessons, whether it is the surveillance related early identification detection, whether it is the cluster approach, as I mentioned in the Japan cases, then multidisciplinary science-based decision support system, worst case decision, scenario planning. In another of the paper, we also talked or argued about the use of different types of new and emerging technologies. We made a comparative analysis of East Asian countries, China, Korea, and Japan. And we found that it was jointly written by one of our Chinese colleagues, one of my good friend from Korea, and myself. And we tried to argue that what are the, like every country are quite well advanced in emerging technologies, but adoption of the technology in an emergency situation, it needs a different governance system, a different legal system. And in that case, the three countries, China, Japan, and Korea, has differential level of implementing the emerging technologies into actual implementation. My last part of it, I have 5 specific messages. This is the work I see Takako Izumi sensei. They are also in the participant list. So she would be more eloquent in explaining this one. So we have been doing this particular work with her and like identifying these innovations. And by innovations, we don't mean that this is like the product-based innovation, but the approach, the process-based innovations are very important. So I won't go into the detail of that, so you can see where you can download it. But the interesting part is here that when we did a survey, we found that the community-based disaster risk reduction is considered as one of the path-breaking innovation, which actually changed the whole concept of the disaster risk reduction. And it was actually around 370 plus people responded from wider different stakeholders, starting from science, technology, academia, to local government, NGOs, students, and so on. And it was very interesting, like that we never thought about the community-based risk reduction as an innovation. For a community, they have been doing this for years. But now, after the governance mechanism has changed, now we look from our side to the community and we say that, oh, that's a community-based disaster risk reduction as an innovation. So I think my main message or takeout from here is that we need to think about also innovation. When you talk about the innovations in disaster risk reduction, we need to highlight the innovations of the process approaches also, not just the product. My second message, I actually touched upon this a little bit about this digital divide. And this is going to be a major, major challenging issue in future, not only in the developing country, but also in the developed countries. And Japan is a classic example of that. I gave this example of the Kochi prefecture, which has the lowest digital media penetration, which has the highest age group, and possibly the largest seismic / tsunami risk in terms of Nankai, Tohoku, the joint cascading earthquake and tsunami. And there I think, in terms of urban, rural, age population, or the gender issues. So how we actually make our risk reduction inclusive. The third point is this open science. This has been a fascinating topic to me, but we could not do much breakthrough about this. We have been talking about the data sharing for so many years. Sendai conference, there were special session on the DRR as the public goods and open science policy. But still, I think that to identify DRR as a public good and make a more fair open science policy where the open source, open data, open innovation, I think that part is still underutilized. So that would be possibly another aspect. The fourth one is the citizen science part. Again, we have not been able to utilize the citizen science possibly that strongly as against the basic environmental field, where the citizen science has been a very common participatory tool. And this is just an example what we did in a city called Varanasi in India, when you have the inundation flooding. So how you understand the inundation flooding, because it is uneven, not the whole city under the same water level. So we try to use this one. We worked with Fujitsu and developed this small app. So with this tire, the inundation of the tire and the nature of that particular tire, whether it is the car, whether it is the truck, whether it is the bus, or whether it is the two-wheeler, based on that, it will give you certain height, and then there will be like these different types of dots, whether it is blue, yellow, or red, and that will be actually plotted in the map. My dream project here is like what we see, like the traffic. When we have the very strong traffic, we see very dark red, and we try to avoid that part. So here also, if we can have very high, like if we have the dark spot on some of the road, like dark red spot, that means the inundation is more than 60 centimeter or so. And in that case, possibly it will help us to navigate the traffic or something like that. So, and for that, again, the citizen participation is very important. And my last message is how we actually make a proper youth involvement and social entrepreneurship. There have been some good news on the youth participation. There are when I was in IRDR, the Integrated Research for Disaster Risk, we started the Young Scientist Program. Unfortunately, from Japan, only 5 young scientists were there, but globally, there were around 170 plus young scientists. UNESCO recently started the You Inspire Alliance, which is more formal bodies of youth group in different countries. So I see there have been a new drive coming for the youth involvement. What is possibly still not happening is the social entrepreneurship, where we involve youth into the more social problem solving and generating some new solutions. What you are seeing here, some of the work which he did last year. So this is the concluding remark. I won't go into the, again, repeating of that, but so I just keep this here, some of the key words which are highlighted in red. And that's all. Thank you very much.